Hello there, and welcome to another episode of Three Guys in the Word. My name is Andrew Ulmer. It's great to be among you once again. And as always, I have with me my fellow brothers in Christ, workers in the field, Chris Miller and Eric Parker. It is great to have you as always, as we are now entering in the final section of this letter, which we hope that you have been following along. And if not, please feel free to review the other videos that we have posted. That way you can see where we've come along in this journey through this letter, and that you're not just jumping here at the end. We encourage you to review those. But before we look at this final chapter and begin to study it further, why don't we just kind of briefly see how each one of us are doing and give us some thoughts from the last episode, what we took away, and let's just make a few comments there. But how are you doing this morning, Chris?
Doing good. Looking forward to our time together. We've got to the finish line, so we're almost done. It's been a really profitable study, I think, going through just taking it a section at a time. I would like to at some point. I don't know if time would ever permit to do this. Kind of listen to every video we did all in one setting. That might be a little crazy to do that. I don't know if I have enough time in a day to do that, but
37 hours straight.
yeah. But going through and reading it, not all at one time, but reading it and discussing it together, I know has been really beneficial for me. There's a lot of, like we've said numerous times, a lot of talking points out of Romans that are taken way out of context. And going through and reading the whole letter, to me, has been really good to be able to do that. Kind of refute some things, but also strengthen, some things that we take out of it already anyway. But last week I thought we did. I really enjoyed, we talked a little bit about Old Testament references a little bit, and then we kind of talked about Paul's journey, his desire to share the gospel, which is a very common theme throughout this book, of him trying to appeal to Jews and Gentiles at the same time. But I'm looking forward to getting into chapter 16. I feel like, I think Eric had mentioned it last week that he had heard somebody say chapter 16 is one of the most important chapters in Romans, because, we get to that ending. It's just like, okay, well, he's just talking about a bunch of names. I'm going to move on, read the next book. But these individuals were important to Paul enough for him to write to them. And like we talked about last week, where he's making that plea for assistance for other Christians, these individuals probably were some of those that had stepped up and taken that call and accepted that challenge, really. So looking forward to getting into that. How you doing, Eric?
I'm doing all right. Lots on my mind. We talked about that before, but that's okay. There's lots of things going on in the world. Yeah, chapter 15, again, picking up this discussion about how we relate to one another. And last week we specifically talked about Paul's commission to the Gentiles, and he didn't want to labor where somebody else had labored necessarily. So his opportunities to visit Rome to this point have not really panned out. It's not really worked out. But he does promise them he is going to come, Lord willing, and that he's going to stop there on his way to Spain, actually, and spreading the gospel to the western borders of Europe. So that's kind of his goal. And he talked about, the contribution for the saints in, Romans 15, around 25, 26, 27, right in there. And he talked about how the Gentiles are tied into the Jews now, and the Jews are tied into the Gentiles. So there's this kind of relationship, and the fact that the Gentiles have been among the most benevolent in helping out a lot of the Jews in Jerusalem, and the love and outpouring of love that has been shown towards them. So definitely lots of good reasons to stay unified, lots of good reasons to welcome and embrace one another, and to strive after that unity. And he's, again, he's optimistic about spending some time with them. It's very similar actually to the end of First Corinthians. Andrew's about to wrap up First Corinthians on Wednesday nights too, and he's very much looking forward to spending time with them, and being able to share with them from of the fruit of the gospel, of the fellowship that they have, and the peace that they have available through God and through Jesus specifically, and what he did. And that launches us into chapter 16. And I might have mentioned it last week, but there's a book called Reading Romans Backwards, and makes the point that chapter 16 really is a great starting point for the letter. And you could actually read it backwards and it would make sense too. Probably not a lot of letters would do that. Usually you've got the citations and things up front that lay out kind of the thesis of the letter. But Romans actually does kind of get to some important things in that final chapter. And I think especially like in verse 17, now I urge you, brethren, keep your eye on those who cause dissensions and hindrances, contrary to the teaching which you learned, and turn away from them. So these are sorts of people that are stirring up dissensions between the Jews and the Gentiles in particular, based on cultural differences. And then you could think about 15 and 14 and work your way backwards through the letter and think about that. And yeah, that actually is kind of an interesting way of doing that. So I've not done it yet, but one of the things that I would like to do is read Romans, starting with chapter 16 and then go chapter 15, 14, 13, and go all the way to chapter 1, and see how that progresses. I think that would be an interesting exercise, and maybe some of our listeners, or maybe you guys might do that too, and we could see what we think about that. But yeah, excited to move forward.
I just looked over at one of the shelves because I thought that I had saw somewhere that we had that book, and I just know that we have a number of commentaries on the book of or the letter of Romans. And so I like how, and we see this over and over. It's almost as if he gives a false perception as the way we read a letter, if we were to receive a letter, as if he's going to end. But then the Apostle Paul says, well, wait a minute, I'm not finished yet. I've got more to talk about, because verse 33 is almost as if a perfect ending to a letter. Now the God of peace be with you all. Amen. Whenever we see an amen, as if we end a prayer, we just think that is going to be the end of it. But that is not obviously not necessarily the case, as we will see in the next, or in this final chapter. But I like the idea we talked about last week of the Apostle Paul offering up the Gentiles as an acceptable sacrifice. You get that priest imagery type, and where we're called, as Peter writes in his epistle, in his letter, that like the Jews under the law of Moses were called to be a holy priesthood, a holy nation. We, the Christians today, are called to be as such. And here's an example of the Apostle Paul being one. And just one other final thing I'll mention. I like where he has this passion that is demonstrated, that he has this burning desire to go where the gospel's not been heard. And it doesn't mean that, okay, that there's not work that needs to be done where the gospel has already been proclaimed. There's always work that needs to be done. But he had this earnest passion to reach, as you already mentioned, to the farthest reaches of the known world as much as he can, with always the caveat of, if the Lord wills, because we may have, as we talked about last night in our class, we may have a plan in our life to do certain things, but God always is the one who ultimately dictates what's going to happen in that plan. He might have other ideas and other thoughts, or not thoughts, but he might have his plan for us trumps whatever our plans may be. It's his will be done, not our will. We hope that this is what is in his plan. But again, when the Apostle Paul was going to be venturing to Jerusalem, he knew that he was going to face obstacles, and he didn't know if he was going to make it to certain areas. And so, but he was willing to do whatever God would have him to do. And that's where we need to be, just to be submit to the will of God in all things. So if you would be please, before we read or begin reading in chapter 16, Eric, go ahead and read our principal verse, and then we'll begin tackling chapter 16.
Our principal verse, just for the goals of this particular program, 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 12. Let no one look down on your youthfulness, but rather verse 13. Until I come, give attention to the public reading of scripture, to exhortation and teaching. You've read that so many times. I don't know why I started on verse 12. But the idea of not neglecting the scriptures, making sure that we're giving attention to the scriptures. And of course, we have these great avenues of communication. Well, they're great in some senses. They're not so great in other senses. But in the 21st century, we have a lot of ways to communicate the word of God, and we want to take advantage of that. And so this program, we put on Facebook, and we share to our website to basically link over to our YouTube page. There's a lot of different options to come across this content. So Chris and I and Andrew definitely would commend this program and make sure that you and we are reading, publicly, and make sure that we're giving attention to the scriptures, not neglecting them.
Chris, if you'd be so kind as to read, let's just focus in for the time being verses 1 and 2 and really give some attention to that. So very important that we understand what's going on here in just verses 1 and 2.
I commend to you Phoebe, our sister, who is a servant of the church in Cenchrea, that you may receive her in the Lord in a worthy manner of the saints, and assist her in whatever business she has need of you. For indeed she has been a helper of many, and of myself also. So we were talking about before we started, some people go to this passage to talk about Phoebe is a deacon. That is not what it's talking about. You can serve in the church in a lot of different ways. Kind of reading about her, I was intrigued. I think this section starts out kind of like the genealogies, in a sense, where you just have a bunch of names and you're reading these names and you're like, okay, whatever, on to the next one. But reading more about her, specifically where the church she was from, in Acts 18 at verse 18, Paul is in that area. So that's probably when he may have come in contact with her. That church was outside of Corinth. So there is some different, things to think about. You read a name and you're like, okay, whatever. You're detached from that person. But we do have resources that we can read and understand more about them. A few places I read said she may have been the one that was carrying the letter. Whether that's true or not doesn't really matter. But what Paul does point out is that she was important to him, and that she helped a number of people, including himself. And like Andrew had talked about, the end of that chapter we looked at last week, chapter 15, where Paul wraps that up. He asked for their prayers, he asked for their support. And evidently Phoebe was one of those people that Paul could depend on. And even so, she had been a helper of many, he says, and of myself also. And it goes back, before I pass it on to Eric, Paul is a person that we hold in very high esteem, writing 2/3 of the New Testament, evangelizing to so many different people, taking the gospel to places and to people that had never heard it before. But really, in chapter 16, I think Paul kind of reveals here in a sense that it's a lot bigger than just him. It's just not him doing all this. He has help, he has encouragement, he has individuals around him who lift him up. Barnabas, one of those, like we look in the book of Acts, who really puts his neck out there for Paul, when others were very scared to do so. So Paul's is one of the main characters of the New Testament, but you have these kind of smaller, obscure characters that we don't know much about. But the most important thing you see is, number one, they were faithful to God. But number two, they cared about the Apostle Paul and they helped him throughout his ministry. So I think one of the big takeaways I take from that is you might not be out front and center like the Apostle Paul was, but you can be useful doing things kind of behind the scenes. She wasn't a deacon. That's not what she was. But she was someone who was very helpful to Paul, which I think is also a good lesson, to teach, women. You think, well, a woman can't preach, a woman can't do this, a woman can't do that. But there are things that all of us can do. And she is taking advantage of the opportunities she can. And it's pretty amazing to be commended in a letter by the Apostle Paul. What do you got, Eric?
Yeah, there's some interesting things to think about, right? I mean, she's called a deacon, but it's not like we might think like an uppercase D deacon. It's not the kind of deacon that's talked about in 1 Timothy 3. What we have to realize about language can be used in different senses. The classic example is that of love. I love Oreos is a lot different than I love my children or my wife. Even the way that I love my children, it can be different than the way that I love my wife. At least in some aspects and in some ways that I might demonstrate that. So there's different senses to different words. The word deacon it's just a word that we've borrowed over from Greek. Diakonos is the Greek word for it. So it's just a shortened version of that, deacon. So the word that is used here is diakonos, which is used in 1 Timothy 3, but there's different senses to the word. That seems clear and evident because of the qualifications in 1 Timothy 3 are male specific. So she's in other words, we might say she's a pillar in that local church. She's a pillar in that local church. She may not be a sort of a formal leader, but she's an informal leader. And even that's kind of like, well, I mean, people recognize her, so she's not like an appointed servant, but she is special as a servant. So hard to describe that, maybe a little different than what we might think of as kind of the appointment of 1 Timothy 3. She's serving without having to be appointed. That's a great thing. If you have people who are willing to serve without appointment in the local church, then that's a blessing too. Now, the best thing is if you can have those who serve with appointment, those who serve with no appointment. So she definitely is a pillar here in Cenchrea. Definitely, close to Corinth, definitely some interesting things there. And her name is telling. Names in the Bible are kind of interesting. Chapter 16 is filled with Greco-Roman names, and not just Greco-Roman names kind of in general, but a lot of Greco-Roman names are tied to their deities and tied to their myths. So like Phoebe, for instance, is basically the feminine form of Phoebus. Phoebus was tied to Apollo. Phoebus means bright. And so it's tied to Apollo. And so you've got her names directly connected to a pagan deity, to a pagan Greco-Roman deity. You've got several names in this list that stand out in that respect. People like Narcissus, Hermes, Olympus, all these sorts of names are connected, etymology, as far as their etymology, as far as their kind of cultural backdrop, specifically. They're connected to pagan deities, which is interesting. That would be quite a rub, I think, for a Jew. This person is named after a pagan deity. How am I supposed to accept them? Every time I say their name, I'm thinking about this pagan worship. I'm thinking about these pagan false deities. So that would be kind of a struggle. I mean, it would kind of be like, I don't know, you make friends with somebody named Jezebel. Like, how could you even say their name without thinking about that context of Jezebel in the Bible? So it would be, I think, a challenge, but he's holding her up, and it's, again, Phoebe, or Phoebus, means bright. And so he's saying she is a star. There's a reason he picks her out to kind of head this list. She's a shining star in this congregation. And we probably all know people like that. And a lot of the shining stars in the local congregation are females, are women. They're the ones that oftentimes the glue that holds things together. They're the ones that are making sure things are taken care of oftentimes. I think of not Charlotte at Taylorsville Road, Charlotte Millett. She is definitely a bright, shining star at that congregation. She's a deacon's wife. She's not a deacon in an appointed sense, but she is absolutely a servant. You'll see her there cleaning the building. She'll be working on the building, getting things decorated in the kids' classrooms, making sure things are organized. If we didn't have her, then we would be much worse off. That's true of Phoebe too. And I think that's kind of the point of Romans 16. Almost like, three of us are preachers, and we will kind of wrap up our lesson. We go in our invitation, and what do people do usually? You kind of say like, okay, let's wrap it up, and then boom, what do people do? They close their Bibles, sit them down in the pew, get their hymnal ready because the hymn's listed on the board, and they're sort of like almost beginning to check out. Now, we all kind of do that. I mean, that's just what we do. We kind of get prepared for the next step of things. And that's not all bad, but I think sometimes we get that sort of impression when we're going into Romans 16, like, okay, he's said really the important stuff. Now he's just kind of like signing off. So let's get ready to, stand and sing. So great things here. She's been absolutely critical in helping this congregation, and she has lived up to her name in the sense that it means bright. She's lived up to her name in that sense, but she's also, again, stepped aside from a really important cultural backdrop for her family, for her parents who named her that. She stepped away from that to serve the church. And so she is a star. She's worthy of honor. Andrew?
I was thinking this morning, and I think it fits well, of just Jesus knows our name, and names are mentioned throughout in the Old Testament a lot of times through genealogies. Of course, we have narratives, and then we have singular mentions of individuals. Again, this is a very just, I mean, it should blow our minds. Like, name is put and make that connection as Jesus did in John 10. He uses the illustration of sheep, and he calls them by their name. They hear his voice, they follow him. And we have a special woman, and heads this list where we'll have several other women mentioned. And this is a great section of showing where you can point out the false nature or false belief that, well, God is misogynist, or the Bible is misogynist. No, women throughout are held in honor. And this is one of them. This woman is being sacrificial in her life. She's leaving where she's lived, and accepts the task of journeying to go to Rome to serve the brothers and sisters at Rome. And as is already mentioned, the Apostle Paul highly esteems this particular woman for the work that she's doing. I mean, she's doing what she can. And as far as servant, it's the same word that even Jesus is described as. So you could say that, okay, he was a deacon too, but not in holding an office sense, because
Yeah, well, I think that's a good point, Andrew, because like he's not married, right?
yeah,
Doesn't meet the qualifications in 1 Timothy 3, so it's got to be a different sense of the word.
yeah, 1 Timothy 3:12, like you mentioned, states specifically deacon has to be the husband of one wife. And that does not pertain to Phoebe, because she cannot be a husband. And so but it does not devalue, and rather than have the office or being in the office of deacon just being designated as servant, just simply say I'm a servant of the church, or I'm a servant of Christ, is so much more. I'm just, because Jesus described himself, I came not to be served, but to serve. And here's a great example of a woman who chose to serve, and is a great illustration for anyone. And the Apostle Paul also further states to them, make sure that you welcome her in fellowship, and that you provide for her needs in order that she can continue what she's doing. So he's asking, make sure you look after her. So that's very important and not should be overlooked. But it's just a beautiful picture of someone doing what she can, and just demonstrates that there is a lot to be done in the body, and that there's a lot that a woman can do, and it just doesn't diminish the role of a woman in the church. There's roles that men can do, there's roles that women are to do, and there's lots of work to be done all around, and we all have to do our part. This woman was willing to do her part. And so let's just not say, well, I can't do this, I can't do that. We're looking at the differences and focusing and harping on what we can and cannot do. I mean, let's look at what work, pray for the talents that God has given me and where I might be fitted in among the body. I may not be out front, giving a lesson, leading a class, presiding over the table, but I read somewhere I may be able to greet someone. I might be good at facilitating relationships, being hospitable, opening my home to people. So there's just so much to learn from an example of one individual, and I think he's very purposeful in leading off with this one particular individual. So hopefully when we look at just small sections, we could just read this last section and just quickly glance over it and just not give a whole lot of attention, when we should be willing to pause, reflect upon, hey, there's 2 verses here, and about this one woman. There, after a while, you just begin to look at it, man, there's a lot there. And can I say, is my life in looking at how Phoebe chose to live, can I say, am I a servant of the church like Phoebe? And so grateful for her example and she's example both to not just women but to men as well. All right, Eric, I know you're gonna love me for this. We'll break it down, but if you be so kind, to read verses 3:16, and then we will kind of break them down. But I know you love names, the beauty of the names, and I know you'll get me back for this at a later date. And this is no, because we've read together and you've kindly asked me to read. But I know that if you be so kind as to read those passages.
Yeah, before we do that, Andrew and I meet once a week. We're studying through the Bible. He and I meet personally, just for our viewers. And the next psalm that we are in has like 80 verses. So I will get Andrew back for the length of this reading, and I will get it back fourfold. No, great section, and lots here. So we could go into the meaning of all these different names. I'm not necessarily going to do that, but I'll read through it, and I will make a few passing comments about what Paul decided to highlight about each individual or group. Romans 16 verse 3, greet Prisca and Aquila, my fellow workers in Christ Jesus, who for my life risked their own necks, to whom not only do I give thanks, but also all the churches of the Gentiles. Also greet the church that is in their house. Greet Epaenetus, my beloved, who is the first convert to Christ from Asia. Greet Mary, who has worked hard for you. Greet Andronicus and Junius, my kinsmen and my fellow prisoners, who are outstanding among the apostles, who also were in Christ before me. Greet Ampliatus, my beloved in the Lord. Greet Urbanus, our fellow worker in Christ, and Stachys, my beloved. Greet Apelles, the approved in Christ. Greet those who are of the household of Aristobulus. Greet Herodian, my kinsman. Greet those of the household of Narcissus, who are in the Lord. Greet Tryphena and Tryphosa, workers in the Lord. Greet Persis, the beloved, who has worked hard in the Lord. Greet Rufus, a choice man in the Lord, also his mother and mine. Greet Asyncritus, Phlegon, Hermes, Patrobus, Hermas, and the brethren with them. Greet Philologus and Julia, Nereus and his sister, and Olympus, and all the saints who are with them. Greet one another with a holy kiss. All the churches of Christ greet you. So there's a lot here. So let's break it down section by section. Prisca and Aquila, you may recognize that's an alternate spelling of Priscilla. Priscilla and Aquila are mentioned in several New Testament books, and we also gain a lot of information about them. They were co-workers of Paul, tent makers. They traveled from several different locations. At one point, they were expelled from Rome because of their connections to Judaism, probably because of the appearance of Christianity on part of Rome. So we've got them, and pretty much everywhere that they are, there's a church in their house. You know, they've opened up their house and they have welcomed the church, and they have made sure that people are able to worship God. And it says that they risk their own necks, which may be a reference to the fact that they might be Romans. Romans could be beheaded, but Romans, as a rule, were not crucified. So it is interesting that it would say something like they risked their necks. They put themselves out there where they could have possibly been killed on behalf of Paul, and Paul does not just lightly esteem that. And apparently all the churches of the Gentiles have been impacted by their presence and their notoriety and their service. So that's really a lot going on for them. There's a few that are overlapping. Several of them Paul calls my beloved. That's, sometimes used of like a husband towards a wife. It's used of good friends towards each other. It's a very strong term of endearment. And I think just kind of a tip of the hat to some of these individuals. Now, he mentions Epaenetus, who is the first convert to Christ from Asia. That would be a reference to Asia Minor specifically. So think like Ephesus, and the 7 churches of Asia that are mentioned in Revelation. Places like Sardis, and some of these other ones that are mentioned there, Revelation 2 and 3, which is interesting, that these are stellar standouts. I mean, that's a pretty important designation, for a whole region. You were the first convert. Same thing like we see in Acts chapter 16, where we have the first convert in Europe. Excuse me. Then we've got Mary. A very simple note about Mary. She's worked hard for you. So not a whole lot said about her, not a whole lot to understand. Mary's a pretty common name. Going back, etymologically, probably to Miriam, and some of the backdrop for Miriam, Aaron's sister. Lots of women named Mary in the New Testament. Then we got Andronicus, Junius, which, even their names again bear some Greco-Roman history. And he calls several of these individuals kinsmen, and whether or not that is literal or whether or not that is like just a sort of a term of endearment. There's maybe a little bit of debate about that. We know that Paul did have a family. He had a nephew, and he had a sister, apparently. So we know that he had family, and it would make sense that he would share the gospel with his family. So could these be literal kinsmen? Well, maybe. But maybe it's just a term of endearment, maybe some discussion there. Talked about them as his fellow prisoners. So again, we've got people in the 1st century very early on getting arrested for the faith, and being persecuted for the faith, although that's going to become more pronounced at the tail end of the 1st century. It says that these individuals, Andronicus and Junius, were outstanding among the apostles, and that's got a couple different ways of interpreting that. That could be that the apostles knew them well, like the capital A apostles knew them well. It could be another sense of the term, people who are sent out. I tend to think that is probably the implication. And I believe that is based on probably what we see with Acts, with right after Stephen gets stoned, we've got the church being sent out in many ways, many people being sent out. And that would be, of course, the precursor to Paul actually being converted on the road to Damascus. So he highlights them as apostles, and he also says that they were converted before he was, which follows that Acts narrative. So that's kind of where I'm at on that. Then we got Ampliatus, again, beloved. Urbanus, fellow worker. Stachys, my beloved. Apelles is called approved in Christ. And sometimes there's kind of like a play on words with some of these names. So, if you dig into each one of these names, you might see that there's kind of a play that Paul is drawing from there. And we've got, of course, the household of Aristobulus. That makes me think of like Philemon. Philemon was influential over his household. Cornelius was influential over his household. So if you're living as a great leader, then you're going to be influential over your household. We've got Herodian, which of course you recognize the root there. Herod. We've got some people in the household of Herod who are being converted to. Narcissus' household in verse 11. Tryphena and Tryphosa are connected together as workers. Persis is beloved. He's worked hard in the Lord. That's kind of similar to what we saw earlier with Mary. Mary had worked hard for you specifically. And then we've got a few other ones. We got Rufus, choice man, his mother, mine. Then we got a whole bunch of different names that are mentioned there in verse 14, probably a reference to maybe like a small congregation or something. Nereus, there's some interesting Greco-Roman mythology with that name too. Olympus, of course, Mount Olympus. That's a feminized spelling of it though. And all the saints are with them. So maybe even like some local congregations around there. He mentioned Cenchrea, Corinth. These are some of the major cities in that region. There's probably some other ones. They're trying to start congregations all over the Roman world, really, making sure that everybody has access to worship. And then we wrap up with 16. 16 is important because it talks about a cultural way that they expressed love and appreciation for each other, the way that they greeted one another, a holy kiss. Of course, there might be an unholy kiss too, people trying to take advantage of each other or that sort of thing. But the holy kiss would be a way of greeting each other, even like in Italy and some other European cultures in particular, they kiss each other on each side of the cheek. So it could be that, think about that today. Could people greet each other that way today? Yeah, absolutely. That would be in line with this text. But there are also other cultural ways of greeting one another. We shake hands here in the United States. That's one of the things that we do. We might hug. We might do, kind of a special handshake with our hands or something. So there's lots of different ways that you could greet somebody. You could even, I don't know, blow a kiss. Like my daughter is a fan of doing like sign language for I love you. She does that to like everybody. So there's lots of different ways that you could greet somebody that we could fulfill this sort of obligation and duty today. And then that final statement in verse 16, all the churches of Christ greet you. There's a couple different senses in which church gets used in the New Testament. This is clearly a congregational sense. There's different congregations in different areas. And he's, again, sort of lumping them all together. They're teaching the same thing. They're doing the same thing. And they extend their greetings to you. So we're not just to be focused on our immediate brethren, our own congregation, but also thinking about the needs of other people, which kind of takes us full circle back to Phoebe, because Phoebe is interested in what's going on at Rome, or at least she's going to be passing through Rome. So we think about our interest in all of each other, the great brotherhood, the church, the global church, the church worldwide, as opposed to just the individual congregation. I know that was a lot. I'm done with my spiel. Chris, what do you have to add?
Well, it's, some of these individuals, like you talk about Priscilla and Aquila, there's quite a few passages that talk about them, and they're very, like with Barnabas, like with Phoebe, very influential in Paul's life. They're there for Paul during hard times. And like Eric had said, they had been run out of Rome. When you get to 2 Timothy 4, we see that they're, back in Ephesus where they once were. So they were very, once again, they don't grab the headlines. They're not the Apostle Paul, but they are very influential in Paul's life, and they mean something to him. And there's probably people reading the letter that know exactly who that is, because they probably had an impact on them too. Going through and reading this, it's like some of the names you're like, yeah, that's somebody that I recognize. Other people, it's like, okay, I don't know who that person is. The thing is, though, about this list that I find so interesting, and Andrew had pointed this out as well, so many different types of people. You have slaves mentioned, you have free people mentioned, you have males mentioned, you have females mentioned. Probably a lot of them were Gentiles. There very well could have been some Jews in there. But you have this long list of all these different individuals who the whole book we've been looking at, Jews and Gentiles coming from so many different areas on so many different things. And then Paul gives this long list of individuals who had helped them. That, we talked in Romans 14 about the matters of conscience. You're allowing these things to get in between us. You're allowing these things to hinder us from following God together. And then Paul gives this long list of all these people who have made some type of impact on him, made some type of impact on his ministry. It's like, you read this, I kind of want to know more about these individuals. It's like, okay, why are they there? You're giving us some information about some of these individuals, and the other ones you're just mentioning their name. When you study the Bible, you kind of get that way. You kind of want to know more and more about these individuals. But it's the same way with like the genealogies, I think. Like in Jesus's genealogy, you have Abraham in there. We can read a whole lot about Abraham. You have Adam in there. We can read a whole lot about Adam. But then there's some like obscure people that you're like, okay, who is this person? And Paul doesn't go in depth on who they all are. But one takeaway you can get is that they made an impact on Paul. They made an impact on the sharing of the gospel. One of the individuals I think that's really interesting is when you get to verse 13 of Romans 16, where he makes mention of greet Rufus, chosen in the Lord, and his mother and mine. So it's like, Paul, are you talking about your mom? Are you talking about, you might read that and think, is that his brother? I think it's one of those things, like Eric had said, kind of that familia mindset of the church kind of being a family. Paul had a lot of adopted, brothers and sisters that weren't blood relatives. That, Priscilla and Aquila were probably like, maybe a brother or sister to him, someone that he looked up to and thought a lot of. I was reading about Rufus, and obviously this isn't something I would bind by any means, but in Mark 15 at verse 21, it talks about Simon of Cyrene, and it says that he's the father of Alexander and Rufus. He's the one who carries Jesus' cross. Is that the same Rufus? I don't know. I can't say whether it is or not, but that would be a really cool connection to make. Because you kind of wonder, like, Simon carries the cross, what happens to him afterwards? How amazing would that be if his son ends up being someone that Paul views as family? I think that would be just an amazing thing to look at. Verses 14 through 15, you have that long list. Like Eric had pointed out, you have Greek names, free names, you have slave names potentially in that. And then reading Romans 16:16, I think it's a passage we go to a lot for the name Church of Christ. People say, well, it's not Baptist, it's not Catholic, it's not Pentecostal. And it is true that the name of Christ Church should bear his name. But reading this as a whole, the whole list, I think in a way, Paul's saying this is what the church looks like. You have free people, you have slaves, you have male, you have female, you have Jew, you have Gentile. These individuals greet you. We greet you as the churches of Christ. And like Eric said, that holy kiss that's mentioned as well. But I want to point one more thing out that we had talked about earlier. We were talking about that idea of deacon, her being a servant. Philippians 2 talks about Jesus being a bondservant, which I think is a big thing. And then if you think about it, the foot of the cross, most of the disciples had left. Luke 23 verse 51 says the women who followed him from Galilee stood at a distance watching these things happen. Even in Jesus's ministry, women had an important part. Paul mentions a number of women in this section, whether it's Rufus's mom, Mary, whether, like we talked about Phoebe, whoever it is, there's a place in the work of the gospel for all of us. Don't get caught up on the title of being an evangelist or a deacon or an elder or whatever it is. Don't get caught up in those titles. These individuals bought in, that they wanted to be involved. And like I said, being in that official capacity would probably make you feel like you've established yourself. But imagine an inspired apostle writing to a prominent church in the biggest city at that period of time in the world, and your name's in the book as an encouragement. It's just, you have to wonder what those individuals felt. Reading that letter and potentially seeing your name there as someone who encourages the Apostle Paul, who had such a giant burden to preach the gospel, that he loved to do so much. So a lot of times, before I pass it on to Andrew, we may see someone get up and preach a sermon. We may see an elder, or elders, plural. You might see them leading a congregation. But I'm sure Eric and Andrew can attest to this as well. While we do the work of an evangelist, the same way Paul did the work of an evangelist, there were a lot of people who put us in the position we're in, who encouraged us when we needed it, who continue to lift us up. And that stuff doesn't go unappreciated. I really appreciate that about Paul. Paul was a big believer in gratitude. He could have wrote all these things, taken all the credit he wanted, but to end the letter, he defers a lot of that to all these individuals who have helped. So we all have a part. There's something we all can do. And to Paul, these were not small things of encouragement. these were things that really, helped him in his sharing of the gospel. We got Andrew.
Well, I was just thinking because I didn't look at the way that Greet was written. I might pass this to Eric to see if this be the case, as if these individuals were going to be coming to Rome to visit the group there. And the Apostle Paul was writing to the brethren there at Rome, expect these individuals and receive them with open arms. These other individuals that he lists beginning in verse 3, because we know from verse 1, at least Phoebe is heading that way. But I am curious the way that the terminology is with greet, if along with beginning in verse 3 through verse 16, that these individuals were going to be coming. Is that the way that it's phrased there, or am I off base, Eric?
The words spot samai is like, tell them I said hello. So I don't think that, I think probably Phoebe is the only one that's the one that's traveling. Yeah, the idea of receiving her specifically would kind of set her apart from these other ones. I think the idea of greetings, just kind of like say hi to these people. This letter specifically for the church at Rome, although it's going to be probably circulated and copied, and again, it's going to become a part of our bound New Testament. But I think it's just the idea that there are people in this area I want to say hi to, and the people with me want to say hi to as well, because that's going to be towards the end of the letter.
So send them my greetings. Okay.
Send them my greetings. Yeah.
Okay. That
some
was
of these,
the other
some of these
thought.
are going to be other pocket congregations around Rome.
Yeah, that was my other thought, and I just wanted to clarify that. But getting back to and I know our brother Steve, who's one of the elders here, did a message on Priscilla and Aquila, and just demonstrating and talking about how just a strong husband and wife team that they represent. I think it was maybe on tent making. I could be incorrect there, but I know that I believe he did a lesson. But we just, as in preparation to talk about what we're talking about now, how important it is. You brought up the Millets, just having strong husband and wife teams in a body, and those that, whether they have children or not, and then they can be examples. And it's just, you just, when you have strong relationships like that, which also mimics the church and the relationship with Christ, and they can be so beneficial and are beneficial in encouraging those that may not be married, and they can open up their homes, as we see here that they very much did so, not only for the purposes of church and worship that was being held at their home at their homes, but they received, I'm sure, like Paul, for instance, it talks about, first of all, when they met Paul in Acts chapter 18, where it talks about at the very beginning there how they were excluded or removed from Rome from the Edict of Claudius, as already alluded to earlier. But just that how even in just a tragic situation that they would have felt and experienced, that their life would have been upended, and that it would have been a trial for anybody. They came and learned the truth, and they were emboldened. You see them later on in the next chapter, or at the end of chapter, where they interact with Apollos. And so that they were able to lovingly pull him aside and instruct him further. And he is a great, um, it was at the end of 18 where they pull him aside lovingly and gave him further instruction and baptism, for instance, because he didn't have the full knowledge that he needed to know. And so they were very much an encourager to him. And just a great example that they had a good name and they lived up to the name of Christ. And there's so many names, again, so many women that are articulated in this list, and they weren't allowing what may have been going around them to deter them in the labor of the work that needed to be done. There's so much going on, you can imagine, in the Roman world that one could get caught up in. Where we see in today in society, there's so much stuff that is thrown at us, and Satan wants to distract us from doing the work of the Lord. Here are just a number of individuals that don't allow the current situation in the world to deter them from doing the work of the church and the work of the kingdom. And that is very encouraging that they were willing to very much potentially put their life on the line and open up their home for people. There was multiple people that opened up their home. And that's just a beautiful thing. I know things change where we're more of, we got our own little world and we kind of isolate ourselves, and things change over times. But this just is a great example of true fellowship, true community, as we see in the early infancy of the church in that first century, where people are concerned about one another, concerned about how things are going. We mentioned that last night about people were aware of one another and what was going on, and making sure that we maintained, or we were in contact with one another, that we were thinking about one another, praying about one another. And there's just this sense of this warm bond, and it should be. There should be this bond between us because we are connected through Christ. We are brothers and sisters. And just being we just can't overlook the fact that being named, and it's not about glorifying an individual. It's just, thanking them. And we can thank people. I know that people may get or hesitate, for instance, if we mention somebody, whether it be in a lesson or during the class or in this video when we named a couple individuals that are part of group here. And we shouldn't be hesitant to state their names and say that, hey, we appreciate what they do. We're not elevate them in an appropriate sense, but we're honoring them and saying we appreciate the work that they contribute, and we encourage other people to contribute. And this is just a great section of just showing there's nothing wrong with saying this person and saying their name and saying they are a worker for the Lord in the kingdom. We appreciate what they do. We know that they, for instance, opened up their home, their or maybe specify like what potential labors that they contribute. And so it's very appropriate to say, I think for this such a person who maybe takes care of the grounds, or this person, I appreciate that they clean the inside building, and just want to acknowledge that they are not overlooked, that every part of the body is important for the function of the whole. So again, names can be easily overlooked. Just kind of, when you get to a long list of names, it may be the tendency just to quickly read through and not give much thought. But why don't we just meditate when lists are given, and just be thinking about why is these potential or why are these individuals being named, and just kind of think about there's a purpose for it. And hopefully, this is the last thing I share before I closed. In scripture, there's referenced numerous times the book of life. And that's where we want to be ultimately named, because that's going to be opened up in the end. And if we are named in the book of life, we'll be welcomed in the eternal home of heaven. And that's where we want to be. And it's our choice whether or not to be in that book of life. And so I appreciate that we had this opportunity to reflect upon this section a little bit more than we may have otherwise considered. And we hope that looking at these names, you may be encouraged to give more thought when you come across, whether it be genealogies or just scriptures in general that designated people. And just think about, okay, what did this person do? Why are they significant? Any final thoughts, any final words that you all have before we close?
I was thinking about, you mentioned meditating on the names. Maybe a good exercise would be, as you're going through a section like this in the scriptures, Romans 16 is not the only one by far. But as you're going through this, think about somebody who you know, who maybe the statement reminds you of. Somebody like, Prisca and Aquila, who for my life risked their necks. You think about somebody who really put themselves out there for you. Or you might think of somebody who works hard, or is a hard worker for you, or a hard worker for the Lord, a choice person, somebody who's like a mother to you, somebody who's like a kinsman to you. Think about these sort of designations and identify them with people that you know, to make it maybe more real for you, because you probably have no idea who Ampliatus is. But think about somebody that you do know, and not only think about that person, pray for that person, and then in some way give attention to what they've done. It's not just for attention's sake, but it does feel nice to be recognized. And I don't think that that's like egocentric, or I don't think that's like ego, maniacal or anything like that. It's nice to feel appreciated. It's when somebody gets up in front of the group and they say, that was a really good sermon by Andrew or Eric, whoever preached it. That feels good. And that doesn't make you like an egocentric person. It feels good. Or somebody, stands up in front of the group and says, we really appreciate Bill for taking out the garbage every Monday, because the garbage, if he didn't do that, then the garbage would be piling up. Anything. We thank Martha Skaggs changes out kind of our flower decoration on the pulpit from time to time, and kind of seasonally. And it's just it's a small thing, but it's a nice thing that's done. So give her kind of a nod, and you thank her for what she's done. Thank the person who's scrubbing the toilets, thank the person who's vacuuming and cleaning up the cough drop wrappers in the pews, whatever. Somebody who's going maybe to drive and pick up somebody else and bring them to church because they can't drive, or they're not able to drive, or whatever. So think about somebody who who serves in this way, and think about a way that you can honor them, because people that devote themselves to the work of the Lord are honorable, and there's a lot of different ways that you can devote yourself to the work of the Lord. So, definitely honor that. Chris, you got anything to add?
Going through and reading this kind of reminds me of Hebrews 11 a little bit. You have the honor roll of faith that talks about all these different individuals in the Old Testament and highlights their faith in God and the actions that they did because of their faith. And you've got Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, Rahab's in there. It talks about a list of people in verses 32 through 34. Like when we think of people with faith, we go to those passages. But reading this as a whole, once again, perspective changes a little bit. Those are individuals that we read of that lived by faith in the Old Testament. And Paul kind of gives us a list of individuals here in the first century that we're trying to live by faith, already have realizing the promise of Jesus Christ coming. And like Eric had said, and Andrew too, you have so many different individuals that do so many things. A lot of people just think the garbage just magically disappears, or the building is just magically cleaned, or the baptistry water's changed out. There's so many different things that go into the work that goes on at the congregation. And a lot of the individuals, probably most of them, probably do those things without any desire of being noticed, but it still doesn't mean that we shouldn't appreciate them. I don't think anybody that Paul mentions was doing it so Paul would write about them in the letter. I don't think that was their motives, but Paul still commends them anyway and tells other people to take notice of that, to bring that up to them, thank them for this, greet them as Phoebe brings you this letter. Appreciate those in your midst that are doing what needs to be done. And that's, I almost kind of like we keep saying, that has to be the end of the letter, right? You're commending all these different people for all these things, and it just really shows, we really can diminish the work of the church by just putting it on one or two people. It's meant for all of us to be involved. All of these individuals had a purpose in this, and I think they realized their purpose in serving God by whether the deed was small in the grand scheme of things or large. So I think it's a great encouragement to us to take on these opportunities and to serve God with them.
Well, we thank you again for taking time and tuning in and reflecting upon what we've talked about. We hope and pray that what we've had to say is pleasing to God and brought him glory, and we pray that is encouraging to you to search the scriptures further. And we just invite you to study, and if you have questions, feel free to reach out to us. You can find Chris at the Shively Church of Christ Facebook page, and Eric or myself at the Tazewell Road Church of Christ Facebook page, or Tazewell RD churchofchrist.com. Just want to make sure that you know that we are here. I want to make sure that all of us are serving the Lord and doing what he has called us to do. And so we hope that you will plan on being with us, Lord willing, when we have our final discussion on the letter of Romans. And we encourage you to look at past videos and to reflect upon what's already been said. Continue to strive in this life to live as God would have us to live. We thank you again for tuning in. And until we are together to study, may God bless you and take care.